The Greek mathematician Pythagoras discovered the intonation system we use today to play melodies and scales. His system provides us with the large whole steps and narrow half steps that lend expression to major and minor thirds and to leading tones. Here is the basic principle of that system. A Pythagorean whole step is constructed of 2/5 on top of each other. In our example, this leads from an open D string to A and to E. If we take the E down 1 octave, we have a large whole step. The resulting E will be in tune as a 4th to the open A string, but it will be much too high to build a 6th as a double stop with the open G string. If we repeat the process from E to B to F sharp, we have another large whole step that provides a high major third in a D major scale. This high F sharp is not usable in a double stop with the open A string, but it sounds correct in the context of a scale or a melody. The printable sheet that comes with this explanation shows you how to build an entire D major scale in the Pythagorean system. When we practice intonation on melodies and scales, we can only compare perfect intervals to open strings, unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves. By definition, you cannot use thirds and sixths as double stops with open strings to check the accuracy of Pythagorean intonation. Thirds and sixths as double stops belong in the domain of just or pure intonation. We use the just intonation system to play thirds and sixths in tune when they occur as double stops. They are derived from the overtone series beyond the pure fourth and the pure fifth, which the just intonation shares with the Pythagorean system. The overtones that create a major third have a ratio of 4 to 5. The resulting major third sounds pleasing as a chord, but it is too narrow as a major third in a Pythagorean scale. If you listen carefully to the F natural and the open A string as a double stop, you will hear it in just intonation. If we play the scale down from A, you will hear that this F natural sounds too high for a Pythagorean scale. Please look at the section "Which system do I use when?" to find out how to make the necessary decisions about intonation systems. The equal temperament intonation system, which is widely used to tune keyboard instruments, assumes that all half steps are equal. In this intonation system, an octave is divided into 1200 cents, and each of the 12 half steps is 100 cents wide. This creates a compromise between the large whole steps and narrow half steps of the Pythagorean system and the narrow major thirds and wide minor thirds of just intonation. This arrangement of pitches makes it possible to play in all keys on the keyboard. The printable chart shows the mathematical differences between all three intonation systems: Pythagorean intonation, just intonation, and equal temperament. Most of the time, we use the Pythagorean system. Any scale, melody, or passage with one line of music will sound cleaner with large whole steps, narrow half steps, large major thirds, narrow minor thirds, and high sevenths or leading tones. When we play double stops, we have to use just intonation. You will find that these two systems are not compatible, and sometimes you must make choices and compromises. Here is one example. In the first chord of the Bach G minor solo sonata, the B flat has to match the G on the E string as a sixth in just intonation. In the following scale, the same B flat needs to be played much lower in the Pythagorean system, otherwise it will sound much too high. Listen to it and then try it out. When playing runs in double stops, like thirds in Paganini's First Caprice, the easiest compromise is to keep the top line in Pythagorean intonation and adjust each lower note of the thirds according to just intonation. This way each double stop is in tune, but you don't lose the sense of direction and expression of the scale. When you play with piano, you stay with Pythagorean intonation most of the time. Only when you play long notes in unison with the piano do you need to adjust to equal temperament. The most difficult art form for intonation on stringed instruments is the string quartet. We constantly run into chords that sound best in just intonation, while the player with a melody wants to apply Pythagorean tuning. It takes many hours of careful practice and reasonable compromises to work this out. Here is an example of a Mozart quartet. As a soloist with orchestra, you also stay with Pythagorean intonation. Even a well-tuned orchestra provides you with a very forgiving range of pitches. You want to make sure you tune your instrument to the highest A you hear in the orchestral environment. This way, you will sound more brilliant. In the previous segments about intonation, I talked about the theory of intonation and how to practice it. It may seem as if intonation is only a matter of right or wrong. It is actually much more important than that. Intonation is one of your most powerful musical tools. A virtuoso piece with perfect Pythagorean intonation will sound very clean, but you can go one step further. In many cases, you can exaggerate the Pythagorean tendencies for high leading tones and low minor thirds in order to create a much stronger emotional effect for the audience. Listen to these two versions of the beginning of Carmen Fantasy. The first version will be exactly Pythagorean. In the second version, you will hear at the end of the phrase a much higher C sharp and a lower B flat. While this seems to be a subtle difference in intonation, the resulting feeling for the listener is extremely powerful. Listen carefully. When you do your slow intonation work with a metronome at 40, you can build these expressive notes into your piece. Your playing will gain an expressive quality and a musical projection that no other tool can provide. We're practicing Pythagorean intonation on the beginning of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. Let's think in the steps of your key. In E minor, your characteristic intervals are the minor third, in this case a G natural, your minor sixth, which is a C, and in most cases a raised 7, which is a D sharp. Yeah. So for the beginning of the Mendelssohn Concerto, you start on the 5th degree, and that's simply a perfect fifth to the open E string. So that's your 5th degree, then you get low third, 1, 5 again, low third, 2, 1, low 6, 1, and the 5 again. Yeah. That will give you the characteristic large whole steps and narrow half steps for a Pythagorean scale. In some cases, you can make the half steps even narrower, and this way your playing becomes even more expressive. So let's try this step by step. You start with a 5, 3, 1, 5, minor third, 2, 1, lower 6, 1, 5. Very good. Now, when you go out and play this with an orchestra, you stay with the Pythagorean intonation. When you stand in the wings while the orchestra is tuning, you will hear, even with the best orchestra, more than one A. You take the highest A that you can hear from the orchestra, tune your violin to it, and then you go out and you play Pythagorean to your own violin. And this way you will always sound really brilliant. So let's try it with piano for the beginning of the Mendelssohn Concerto. Very good. Now you just have to go through every phrase in the piece that slowly for each step in the Pythagorean scale. We're working on different intonation systems for string quartets. The basic question is, when do we use Pythagorean intonation and when do we use the just temperament? Let's talk about tuning the quartet first. If you tune in really perfect fifths, then the cello C string to the open E string of the violin no longer make a major third. They would be way too far apart, and this phenomenon is called the Pythagorean coma. So we need to tune the fifth a little bit narrower to make the C string and the E string come together as a major third. Can I hear that once from the quartet? That's right, and that will only happen if you tune all the fifths a little bit narrower than the really in tune open fifth. Yeah? When you start working on a piece, it's a very good idea to establish the key. Let's play a D in the cello, a D in the first violin to double it, and an A in the second violin. Can I hear that? That's right. So you always want to tune the perfect intervals in a string quartet first, always fourth, fifth, and octaves before you add any thirds or sixths. Yeah. Now let's hear the same chord with the F sharp in the viola, and you will find that your F sharp has to be considerably lower than you would like to play it in Pythagorean intonation. Let's hear that. Very good. That feels really low, doesn't it? So let's go to our Mozart quartet. We're doing Mozart quartet in D major, K575. It starts with a D major triad in the first violin. Can I hear those three notes? Yeah, so the violinist would like to play this in Pythagorean intonation, which would push the F sharp quite high, but you're going to have to deal with a D in the viola, which means you have to compromise and play the F sharp lower to make it fit in just intonation. Can I hear note by note? Very good. Now let's add the F sharp and the A from the second violin to this. Let's play the first 4 bars. That sounds very good. In the 5th bar, the first violin plays alone and needs to play the F sharp and the C sharp in Pythagorean intonation. Can you play that bar for us? Very good. If you would play the C sharp and the F sharp in just intonation, they would be way too low and it would sound very out of tune. The following bar, this second violin also has a C sharp, but it has to match the chord between the first violin and the viola, so we're back to just intonation and the C sharp is a little bit lower. Can I have bar 6? In the next bar, we have a unison between the first violin and the viola, which needs to be in Pythagorean intonation. That means your sharps have to be quite high. Can I hear that note by note? So now in bar 9, we hear the theme again. This time it's played by the viola. You'll have to compromise again on your F sharp because it has to match the D of the cello. Can I hear bar 9 through 12? Very nice. I would like to point out from bar 25 through 27, first in the first violin, then in second violin and cello, we have some passing notes that are not part of the chord, and they need to be played with Pythagorean intonation. Can we play 25 through 27? Very good. Since these passing notes are not part of the chord, they lend a really expressive quality to the phrase if they're played with Pythagorean intonation. So let's play the entire beginning of this piece until bar 32. Good, that's very nice. Now you have to come up with the patience to practice every phrase in the piece like this, and that means that 50% to 75% of your practice time will be spent on intonation. But that makes for very beautiful string quartet playing. Hi, we're practicing intonation with the metronome at 40, and we'll do it on the second theme of Mozart's G major violin concerto. At first, we want to practice each pitch separately, regardless of the rhythm. So I'll turn the metronome on at 40, And you will play one pitch, then wait for one beat, and then play the next pitch on the next beat. Let's try that. Very good. That's really good intonation. It's very important that we use this rest to hear the next pitch in our head. If we don't have a concept of the next pitch, then we have no comparison to what we're actually playing. And if we don't have a comparison, then any pitch would be good enough. The next step with this is that we leave the metronome at 40, but we play one pitch per beat without the rest. Let's try that. Very good. And while you do it, you're doing this right, you put the fingers down very gently to feel the intonation for each pitch. Mm-hmm. The next step is to play it at 40, but with the correct rhythm. So we'll take the correct half notes, quarter notes, and 16th notes. Very good. So that's practicing at 40 to make sure that every note is exactly where it belongs. In the next exercise, I will show you how to speed this up to the concert speed.
Okay.
In the previous exercise, we showed how to practice with the metronome at 40 to make sure that every note is in the right place. Now let's speed this up a little bit. We will go in increments of 20. So the metronome is set at 60, and we'll still play it without vibrato, but with the correct rhythms. Very good. Now, if this were a new piece, you'd have to repeat it several times to get it just right, and you will find that every speed will have its own challenges. So let's go up another 20 to metronome number 80, still without vibrato. Good. Now let's try it at the same speed, metronome number 80, with vibrato. Okay, so now we're ready to do it at 100, again without vibrato. And the same speed with vibrato. Excellent. Now you're ready to play it at the concert speed, which is probably 116 to 120. Very good. That's beautiful intonation. Now, a few things that are very important about this way of practicing. You want to practice this in very small sections. Maybe half a phrase, sometimes only 8 notes, but never half a page. Also, you want to spend about 50% of your practice time practicing either at 40 or in these increments to speed it up very carefully. That means if you practice the Mozart concerto for 2 hours, 1 hour would be with a metronome at very slow speeds. You come to a point where intonation is no longer a question of right or wrong, but it's a question of coloring the keys. And when you're that accurate, then intonation becomes one of your most powerful musical tools.